A $50 million crimson painting hangs on the wall. A billionaire painter stands on stage, soaking in applause, when a quiet janitor steps up to the microphone and whispers a chilling truth. A world-renowned billionaire artist stands on a global stage, auctioning his masterpiece for $50 million. He boasts to the elite crowd that its unique crimson color was born from his inner fire. But at that exact second, a quiet janitor walks up to the main microphone and whispers, "That red isn't fire, Julian. It's the blood of my father, whom you murdered 10 years ago." If you think you've heard the ultimate revenge story, wait until the final second of this video. Because this woman has been planning this exact masterpiece of vengeance for 3,650 days. 10 years ago, Elena had a life filled with warmth, laughter, and art. Her father, Marcus, was a brilliant chemical artist who had spent decades developing a revolutionary, everlasting crimson dye. It was a flawless shade of red that never faded, resistant to time and elements, a chemical breakthrough worth billions. Julian Vance, an ambitious but bankrupt art dealer at the time, discovered Marcus's secret formula and let his greed consume him. One freezing winter night, Julian locked Marcus inside his own industrial furnace and set the studio ablaze. Elena arrived just in time to watch the warehouse burn, her father's screams echoing in the night as Julian escaped with the stolen blueprints. When Elena went to the police, she realized how deeply Julian's new wealth could reach. Having already patented the formula under his own name, Julian used his instant billions to bribe the authorities, branding Elena as a traumatized, unstable girl, and forcing her into silence. Julian Vance became a global art phenomenon, celebrated as the master of red, while Elena was left with nothing but ashes. But Julian forgot one fundamental rule of nature. Fire destroys, but it leaves behind ash. And ash doesn't burn twice. Elena changed her name, buried her past, and began brewing a cold, calculated formula for absolute ruin. Elena didn't waste time fighting a broken legal system. She knew that to tear down a god, you don't use a gavel. You use the perfect poison, at the perfect time. And she spent a decade mixing it. Elena's plan wasn't a simple act of violence. She wanted to destroy Julian at the absolute peak of his global fame. To execute this, she completely altered her appearance, wore oversized faded clothes, and took a low-paying job as a janitor at the prestigious Vance Art Gallery. For years, she blended into the background, sweeping floors, scrubbing toilets, and throwing away the trash of billionaires who looked right through her. Julian himself walked past her every single day, radiating wealth and arrogance, completely blind to the fact that the girl whose life he destroyed was now cleaning the dirt off his expensive shoes. But behind her submissive posture and quiet demeanor, Elena's brilliant mind was working like a supercomputer. While cleaning the private labs and executive suites, she wasn't just dusting shelves, she was tracking inventory. She memorized every chemical shipment, security code, and exclusive supplier that Vance Enterprises utilized. Over 10 years of silent espionage, she uncovered a dark, filthy secret. Julian hadn't painted a single canvas in years. He was a fraud who blackmailed starving, undocumented artists, forcing them to paint in hidden basements while he simply signed his name on the final canvas and sold it for millions. She had mapped out every single crack in his golden empire. Now, all she needed was the final canvas to execute the death blow. And ironically, Julian gave her the perfect opportunity, the Crimson Symphony. To celebrate his 10th anniversary as a global art icon, Julian announced the creation of his ultimate masterpiece, the Crimson Symphony. He publicly declared that he would be using the rarest, purest form of his signature red dye for this single painting, which would be auctioned live in front of the international press. This was the exact catalyst Elena had been waiting for. One late night, when the gallery was completely empty and the security guards were deep in a hacked, automated sleep cycle, Elena bypassed the biometric locks and slipped into Julian's private mixing studio. In her steady hands, she held a small glass vial containing a specialized, clear chemical compound she had developed using her father's old notebooks. This compound was invisible to the naked eye, but when mixed with Marcus's original crimson dye, it initiated a slow, molecular reaction programmed to activate exactly 48 hours later. With absolute mathematical precision, Elena poured the clear fluid into Julian's primary paint buckets. The paint looked identical, smelling of nothing but luxury, but it was no longer just an art medium. It was a visual time bomb waiting for the perfect spotlight. Julian spent the next 2 days painting his grand masterpiece, completely ecstatic about the millions he was about to make. He had no idea that every brushstroke was actually signing his own arrest warrant. Friday night arrived and the Vance Art Gallery was transformed into a glittering sea of diamonds, high-end champagne, elite politicians, and international news cameras broadcasting live across the globe. In the center of the grand ballroom stood a massive stage, where a heavy black velvet curtain concealed the Crimson Symphony. Julian Vance stepped up to the podium, wearing a flawless tailored suit, his face flashing the arrogant, million-dollar smile that the media adored. The applause was deafening, treating him like a living deity of modern art. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I present to you the absolute soul of my career. Julian projected into the microphone, his voice dripping with vanity. The red you are about to see cannot be replicated by any living soul. It comes directly from my own bloodline. With a dramatic gesture, the curtain fell, revealing a massive, breathtakingly vivid canvas of deep, haunting crimson. The crowd gasped in awe, and the bidding started instantly, skyrocketing from $10 million to a staggering $50 million in less than 2 minutes. From the far corner of the room, dressed in her janitor uniform, Elena quietly accessed the main media control panel. She flicked a switch and activated her microphone. Julian raised his hands to celebrate his historic sale, but before the gavel could slam down, a bone-chilling voice echoed through the gallery speakers, freezing the entire room in absolute terror. "Did you say that red comes from your bloodline, Julian?" The voice through the speakers was calm, deep, and as cold as an Arctic winter. The elite guests stopped talking instantly, looking around in utter confusion. Julian's smile vanished, his face turning pale. "What is this? Security, cut the audio feeds right now," he screamed into his mic, but his microphone was completely dead. Elena's custom hacker software had locked down the entire electrical grid of the building. "That color doesn't belong to you," the freezing voice continued. "That is the eternal red of Marcus, the man you burned alive 10 years ago to steal his life's work." At that exact moment, the main gallery lights cut out, and the automated UV projection lights overhead flicked on. The chemical reaction Elena had planted inside the paint finally reached its climax under the ultraviolet spectrum. The brilliant crimson color began to rapidly dissolve, bubbling and fading away on live television. Beneath the vanishing red layer, a dark, permanent chemical reaction began to bleed through the canvas. It wasn't an abstract painting anymore. It was a perfectly legible, highly detailed print of the original stolen patents, alongside a step-by-step forensic analysis of how Julian had forged Marcus's signatures. The elite crowd watched in sheer horror as a multi-million-dollar masterpiece literally transformed into a giant billboard of a billionaire's murder confession. But the real nightmare was just starting for Julian. The bleeding canvas. Panic erupted through the grand ballroom. Julian frantically tried to run off the stage, but the gallery's heavy, automated security doors slammed shut, magnetically locking everyone inside. "This is a lie. A digital hoax by a competitor," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking as he clutched the podium. But the canvas didn't stop shifting. The speakers suddenly blasted an old, restored audio file from the night of the fire. A hidden recording Elena had salvaged, where Julian's voice could be clearly heard threatening Marcus and admitting to setting the warehouse ablaze. The international media cameras never stopped rolling. The live broadcast was being fed to millions of homes worldwide. In less than 10 minutes, the Master of Red was completely stripped of his fame, his dignity, and his empire. The billionaires who had been chanting his name minutes ago backed away from him in disgust. Julian collapsed onto his knees on the very stage he had built on a mountain of lies, hyperventilating as the news tickers beneath his live feed announced that his company's stocks had dropped to absolute zero. As he wept in utter ruin on the floor, he looked up through the flashing camera lights and saw a single figure walking toward him. A ghost he thought he had buried forever. The masterpiece cleansed. Through the chaotic, screaming crowd, Elena walked calmly toward the stage. She unbuttoned her gray janitor apron and let it drop to the floor, revealing a flawless, elegant black silk dress underneath. Her face was completely serene, glowing with a deep, peaceful justice. She stepped onto the stage and stood directly over the trembling billionaire. Julian looked up, his eyes wide with absolute horror as recognition finally flooded his mind. You're supposed to be locked away. You're dead, he whimpered. Elena knelt down slightly, her voice a sharp, quiet whisper that cut through his panic. My father died in that fire, Julian. But his crimson dye was everlasting. You thought you stole his color, but his color just painted your grave. At that exact second, the heavy glass doors of the gallery were breached by federal agents and SWAT teams. They rushed the stage, forcing Julian into the ground and slamming heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. He was dragged away, sobbing and screaming, past the flashing lights of the press he had so desperately craved. Elena turned her back to the cameras and looked at the canvas one last time. Her father's name was finally clean, written in permanent ink for the entire world to see. She walked out of the gallery into the cool, raining night, letting the water wash away 10 years of hidden pain. She wasn't a shadow in a gray uniform anymore. The masterpiece was finally finished, and Elena was finally free. The following morning, every major headline across the globe carried the same shocking story. The fall of a fraud, billionaire artist faces life sentence. Julian Vance was stripped of every asset, title and dollar, spending the rest of his days inside a concrete cell with nothing but white walls to look at. All of his wealth was legally transferred into a global foundation for exploited artists, created in the name of Marcus. As for Elena, she vanished from the public eye, taking a new name and living a life of quiet peace. Remember this. Never push a quiet person to the point where they no longer fear the consequences. Because when an innocent person loses everything, they become